In 1935, Robert Sidney Hand, the oldest of three brothers from California, came to John Brown University for high school studies. He was followed later by his younger brothers William Reeves Hand and Harold Holmes Hand. All three brothers joined the Navy shortly after their time at John Brown. Younger brothers William and Harold were assigned to the battleship USS West Virginia, which would be on Battleship Row at the time of December 7, 1941 Pearl Harbor attack. Oldest brother Robert enlisted later and went to the aircraft carrier USS Lexington. When William's first enlistment period ended, he re-upped incredibly on December 6, 1941. The West Virginia was sunk at anchor during the December 7th attack, but both William and Harold survived and were shortly assigned to new ships. Harold reported aboard the undamaged cruiser USS San Francisco the next day, and William reported aboard the aircraft carrier USS Saratoga, sister ship to his brother's Lexington, a week later. On May 8, 1942, the Lexington sank after suffering crippling damage in the Battle of the Coral Sea. Over 2,700 crewmen, including Robert Hand, were successfully evacuated to other ships before the carrier descended to the ocean floor. Several months later, in the early morning dark of November 1, 1942, as part of the first action in what would be called the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, a furious, close-range cruiser battle unfolded. The San Francisco was in the middle of the action, with younger brother Harold 4 days shy of his 21st birthday at his battle station as a gunner in the Crow's Nest. The San Francisco took dozens of hits in the running battle and suffered numerous fires on board. She did not sink, but more than 70 men lost their lives that night. Harold Hand was one of those casualties, his body buried at sea. At the end of December, most likely after receiving word of Harold's death, William transferred off of the Saratoga and entered submarine training. In July 1943, William returned to Pearl Harbor as a submariner and reported aboard the USS Wahoo in time to join her 6th War Patrol. That patrol was deemed a military failure for not sinking any substantial enemy ships. So, in September, Wahoo's skipper requested permission to patrol again in the heart of the enemy's empire. Wahoo went to the Sea of Japan and was sunk on October 11, 1943, with the loss of all aboard. William Hand was 3 weeks shy of his 23rd birthday. Oldest brother Robert survived the war and continued his Navy career for several years after the war's end, serving as an aviation mechanic aboard carriers. Winford McKinley was a 16-year-old preacher's son from Oklahoma when he arrived at JBU in 1933. He enlisted in the Marines in 1938. His first assignment was to the Marine Attachment aboard the battleship USS Nevada, stationed at Pearl Harbor. In mid-1941, he shipped out with a garrison of fewer than 500 Marines to guard a tiny atoll halfway across the Pacific called Wake Island. A Japanese amphibious force spent the week after Pearl Harbor staging an assault on Wake Island, some 2,300 miles away from Pearl. On that distant atoll, 24-year-old Corporal McKinley and another former JBU student, 21-year-old Private Roger Dorman, participated in a stubborn defense that repelled the first Japanese attempts to land troops ashore on December 11th. Dorman was a college freshman at JBU in 1939 and joined the Marines March 1941. He was from rural Freestone County, Texas. The Japanese invasion force would make another attempt to seize Wake Island a couple of days before Christmas 1941. McKinley commanded a handful of Marines and civilians manning a machine gun emplacement that guarded one end of the island's airfield. His actions during the defense of Wake are chronicled in numerous books about the siege. But on December 23rd, the Marines were forced to surrender to a numerical superior enemy and became prisoners of war. About 2 weeks after the surrender, McKinley and Dorman were loaded up with some 1,200 other military and civilian POWs from Wake on the hell ship Nita Maru, a Japanese ocean liner pressed into use as a POW transport. For a week in January, the men were carried across the ocean in inhumane conditions to their eventual destination, a prison camp in Japanese-occupied China. McKinley and Dorman spent over 3.5 years as slave labor in China and Japan. A few days before the Japanese surrender, in 1945, as it became clear that the cruel prison camp guard's authority was drawing to an end, McKinley defiantly led a small group of prisoners over the prison compound fence, went for a walk in broad daylight, then sauntered back into camp a few hours later. His group faced no repercussions upon their return. Both McKinley and Dorman survived the duration of their captivity and were liberated in 1945. Two of John Brown's earliest students suffered perhaps the most of all the school's alumni lost. Willis Damon Wright was a teenager in 1920s Fayetteville, Arkansas, where his father worked in the University of Arkansas's creamery making butter. Wright was an accomplished Boy Scout, becoming the first boy in Fayetteville to achieve the high rank of Life Scout in 1923. He attended the John Brown High School along with his younger cousin Neil Bliss Peterson. He was born in Texas, but his father died before Peterson was 10. His mother's second husband was a farmer in Cane Hill, about 30 miles south of Siloam Springs. The cousins were at John Brown until about 1924. Peterson moved to California by the time he was 20, but Wright continued to live in Siloam Springs until after his father died in 1931. By 1940, after working on a Wyoming ranch, Wright was in the Army, stationed with a work crew in the California desert near the future Edwards Air Force Base. Peterson was a highway construction truck driver in Long Beach, California, and was providing for his mother who had left Peterson's unsavory stepfather a few years earlier. In 1941, Peterson enlisted in the Army for Philippine service, which at the time was considered almost an assignment to paradise. By June, he was in the Philippine Islands, assigned to the artillery regiment providing coastal defense in and around the waters of Manila Bay. Peterson was assigned to Battery I, manning the anti-aircraft gun emplacements that fortified the small Cabello Island that flanked the larger fortress island of Corregidor. Late in 1941, as the prospect of war with Japan became all but certain, Wright and several of the men from his California desert barracks were given orders to join the ground echelon of the 19th Bomb Group, which transported several B-17 bomber squadrons across the Pacific to reinforce the Philippines. Wright enjoyed peacetime assignment in the Philippines for less than 2 months. Just a few hours after the Pearl Harbor attack, about half of the group's bombers were parked at Clark Field, north of Manila, where all but a few planes were totally destroyed in the initial Japanese assault. Suddenly Wright, his barracks mates from California, and most of the rest of the 19th Bomb Group's men were turned into provisional infantry, salvaging machine guns from their wrecked bombers to use in the coming fight. They retreated to the Bataan Peninsula, where an exhausting months-long siege would unfold. Across the waters of Manila Bay, on Cabello Island, Peterson's Battery Idaho expended nearly 3,000 rounds of ammunition during the months of the Japanese siege of Bataan and Corregidor. In a last desperate act of defiance, on the morning of May 6, 1942, the battery's artillerymen pointed their anti-aircraft guns horizontally and began firing explosive rounds across the waterway into Japanese troops making their final landing on Corregidor. By midnight, the emancipated, exhausted American forces throughout Manila Bay had surrendered to the Japanese, and thousands of men, including the cousins from John Brown, became prisoners of war. Wright and Peterson were both transferred through the Bilibid prison on the outskirts of Manila, with Peterson being sent to the largest POW camp at nearby Cabanatuan, and Wright being shipped off to the Davao POW camp on the Philippines' southernmost major island of Mindanao. American POWs endured horrific conditions in the Philippines. For many, including these cousins, the exact details of their final painful years can never be known. but the appalling tragedy of their deaths is well documented in U.S. Navy records. For Wright and Peterson, each ended up being loaded with atrociously cruel POW transport ships that were then sadly attacked by American forces. Wright died on September 7, 1944, aboard the infamous Chinook Mare. The ship, believed by U.S. intelligence to be carrying Japanese troops, was torpedoed by the submarine USS Paddle, and in the hours before the transport sank, nearly 700 American and Allied POWs died from the attack or were murdered en masse by their captors. Peterson died on December 15, 1944, as a prisoner on the Orioku Maru. This ship was loaded with over 1,600 POWs when it was attacked by carrier planes from the USS Hornet. Wright was 38 years old at the time of his death. His cousin was 35. Truett Mayo Guthrie spent his last 2 years of high school at John Brown, graduating from the academy in 1938. His father had been a doctor in El Dorado, Arkansas, but died when Guthrie was 11 years old. Guthrie was the president of the Academy Engineers Club, and a 1938 yearbook showed his ambition to become a naval officer. The quote next to his graduation picture was, "The wide open sea beckons and promises many interesting adventures." The summer after graduation, Guthrie enlisted in the Navy and was ordered to the USS Vincennes. During his first 3 years aboard, he indeed saw some interesting adventures, as the Vincennes exercised in the Virgin Islands, visited Cuba, and sailed to South Africa to pick up a shipment of gold bullion as the lend-lease payment from Great Britain. Guthrie made his EM-1C, Electrician's Mate First Class, rating in late 1941, and was then detached from the Vincennes to attend Electrical Interior Communications School in Washington, D.C. School kept him ashore for 8 months, during which time he missed participating in the Vincennes' support of the famed Doolittle raid on Tokyo and her action in the Battle of Midway. Duty took him to the West Coast to report back aboard the Vincennes on June 17th. On the night of August 8th through 9th, near Savo Island off the coast of Guadalcanal, the Vincennes joined the midnight surface battle between a total of 15 heavy and light cruisers of the U.S. and Japanese navies, plus several destroyers. According to the Navy Department's official history of the ship released to the public near the end of the war, star shells burst high, illuminating attacker and defender alike, and while broad beams of searchlights swept the sea and 2 fleets slugged it out at almost point-blank range. It is not known what battle station Guthrie manned during the action, but as the EM-1C with recent training in interior ship communications, it is possible he was stationed deep in the ship, in one of the communications equipment rooms. Vincennes took more than 80 hits from the enemy's guns and was holed by at least 1 torpedo during a roughly 15-minute long fight. The order to abandon ship came just 20 minutes after the Japanese force withdrew, and the majority of the crew clung to life rafts through the night until rescue came. Robert Neal King of Oklahoma was at JBU for 2 years of college through 1941. He joined the Navy in 1942 and reported aboard the light cruiser USS St. Louis. The ship was assigned to patrol the Solomon Islands around Guadalcanal in 1943. King may have been injured in the line of duty or contracted a serious illness in the festering climate, for he spent a month aboard the hospital ship USS Relief for treatment, then was at the Mare Island Naval Hospital in California for another 10 days in October of 1943. After recovering, he was back aboard the St. Louis when one of the earliest organized kamikaze attacks of the war took place on November 27, 1944, in the waters of Leyte Gulf in the Philippines. The ship was supporting fleet refueling operations around noon, with many sailors starting to form lunchtime chow line, when a group of 10 enemy aircraft was sighted. King manned one of the 20mm anti-aircraft guns, that started pouring fire into a group of 4 diving planes at 11:37 a.m. One of those planes, aflame and upside down, but still carrying an unexploded bomb, crashed onto the rear deck of the St. Louis, descending into her aft hangar deck and exploding. All of the anti-aircraft crew and 4 rear gun tubs were wounded or killed in the blast. According to a newspaper account after the war, King died trying to save another sailor. The Navy announced a year later that he had been posthumously awarded the Silver Star for his valor. He was 26 years old at the time of his death, and his body was returned home for burial in 1948. Bruce Garda Biddle came to JBU during the war, spending 1942 through 1944 at the college. During Biddle's time at JBU, his father died and was buried across the street from campus in Oak Hill Cemetery. Biddle helped run the KUOA radio station while at JBU, but left at the age of 18 to join the Merchant Marines, where he was a radio operator on the transport ship SS Louis L. Dyche. Little more than a week later, on January 4, 1945, the Dyche was loaded with ammunition for delivery to U.S. forces on Maduro when their convoy was attacked by Japanese aircraft. A kamikaze angle toward the explosive-laden Dyche and struck. In a book by Gary L. McIntosh chronicling the experiences of the author's father aboard a destroyer in the area, the fate of the Dyche was recalled.
The ship blew up with a tremendous explosion, sending a mushroom-shaped cloud high above Mandarin Bay and creating a wave of water 20 feet high that inundated gun emplacements and living shelters ashore.
Men died on nearby ships as the debris and unexploded ordnance rained down upon the fleet. The 71 crew members of the Dyche had been vaporized in an instant. Bruce Biddle was 19 years old. Just a few months later, his mother, Emily Garda Biddle, was invited to be a guest of honor at the groundbreaking ceremony of JBU's Cathedral of the Ozarks on May 23, 1945, a building whose cornerstone would eventually bear the dedication in memory of our boys. Another pair of brothers attended JBU together before fighting and dying in the skies over the Pacific. John W. Miller came to the college in 1935. His younger brother, Robert Douglas Miller, followed a year or so later. They came from Wortham, Texas, and each attended JBU for about a year. After their time at JBU, John became a rural mail carrier, and Robert worked with a funeral company until they each joined the Army. John enlisted in February 1941, earned a lieutenant's commission and his pilot wings in 1943, and finally went overseas at the end of 1944 with a B-29 squadron on Saipan. On January 23, 1945, he was a co-pilot on a bombing mission against the Mitsubishi Aircraft Engine Factory in Nagoya, Japan. After a successful bombing run, John's plane came under an intense enemy fighter attack. In the 12 minutes it took to reach the coast after departing the target area, John's plane fought off more than 70 attack runs by the enemy fighters. The aerial combat was so furious, the mission log reports that one of the B-29's turrets was down to 12 remaining rounds of ammunition at the end of the action. On one of the fighter's passes, an explosive shell penetrated the cockpit and grievously wounded John. The aircraft was heavily damaged, eventually losing 2 of its 4 engines, and it was several minutes before crew could attend to John's wounds. Other bombers of the formation slowed down to provide escort and additional defense for the wounded plane. The crew's report says that after the attacks ended, the plane's radio operator, navigator, and bombardier all worked feverishly to try and save John's life. Upon landing, the bullet-ridden B-29 was met by an ambulance to carry John's body. Examining his wounds, the squadron's flight surgeon assured the crew that there was nothing they could have done to save his life. John W. Miller was 28 years old and buried in the squadron cemetery. 6 days after his brother's last mission from Saipan, Robert Douglas Miller arrived on the island. He too was in a B-29 squadron as a gunner and radio operator. On a bombing mission just a month after John's death, Robert's plane crashed into another plane at the formation's assembly point, and both B-29s plummeted into the sea and exploded. Another plane circled the area for 1 hour and 40 minutes, according to a squadron's records, but saw no survivors. None of the crew from either plane were recovered. Robert Miller was 25 years old. In 1948, the cemetery on Saipan was closed, and John's body was exhumed and returned to Texas. Local newspaper reports from the time say that a large group of Wortham citizens met the June 14th morning train, which carried John's flag-draped casket. Having but a single body brought home to represent the sacrifices of their only 2 sons, the Miller family held a memorial service that afternoon for both brothers, more than 3 years after they gave their lives. Howard Edward Keach was born in 1907 in Bedfordshire, England, to an English father and an American mother. The family spent many years as missionaries in Central America, printing and distributing Christian literature. Keach's father died when he was 16, and the family made the U.S. their permanent home. He attended college at John Brown in the 1930s, got married, and became JBU's professor of printing a few years later. By 1941, he was the head of JBU's University Press and the faculty advisor for the school's yearbook staff, and was elected vice president of the JBU Alumni Association in 1942. In March 1944, he enlisted as a 36-year-old private in the Army. By this time, almost 20 of his former classmates and students had already died in the war. On April 9, 1945, Keach's unit, the 165th Infantry Regiment, landed on Okinawa. Their primary mission was to destroy the Japanese forces holding Item Pocket, a defensive strongpoint guarding the island's airfield. The enemy resistance has been described by historians of the Bloody Okinawa campaign as fanatical, and it took 9 days for Keach's regiment to finally defeat the last holdouts of Item Pocket. On April 29th, about 3 dozen surviving Japanese soldiers emerged from the strongpoint in the early morning to make a final charge against the 165th Regiment lines. Keach died on this day, earning a Bronze Star for his valor in the fight. His body could not be recovered, and today his name is listed on a memorial cenotaph in the Courts of the Missing in Honolulu. At his death, Keach was 37 years old. Thomas Eugene McKnight was from Yellville, Arkansas, the 6th of 11 children. He came to the high school academy in 1926, graduating in 1928. McKnight was active at John Brown, serving in the leadership of several clubs geared toward Christian ministry. His first semester on campus, he was one of a dozen boys to find the ministerial club, becoming its first vice president. The club members supported small community churches that had no regular pastors. John Brown yearbooks from the 1920s included a class prophecy for each student. For McKnight, it was certainly present. It foretold Thomas McKnight, evangelist and lecturer, had won a place beside that of Brian in the hearts of his countrymen. Tom's words carried with them the ring of truth and earnest appeal for better and greater things. McKnight went on to get married and have a daughter in the 1930s, then studied at Southern Methodist University. He graduated from there in 1942 and joined the Army as a Methodist chaplain the day after his commencement. McKnight served in New Guinea and went ashore after the first waves of American invasion forces during the liberation of the Admiralty Islands in early 1944. He wrote from the battlefield in an article published in June 15, 1944, Arkansas Methodist Magazine, about the chaplain's duty of accompanying unarmed his unit's combat patrols and assisting the medics in attending to the wounded and dying.
We have seen enough sacrifice and devotion to duty here to put to shame the weak efforts that the average Christian puts forth in the name of him who bore his cross and bade us follow him in so doing. It takes much of physical, mental, and spiritual strength to care for a stream of wounded all the day long, and hold brief funeral services for several through the day. Never before had the sustaining power of prayer been so evident for us and for the men we served.
By early 1945, he held the rank of captain and was with the 7th Cavalry Regiment, advancing into the Philippines to liberate Manila. In 1960, author Melbourne C. Chandler wrote of the unit's shining examples of gallantry, self-sacrifice, and heroism, and placed Chaplain McKnight's actions of February 8, 1945, first among his examples. Chandler reported that McKnight left his foxhole during a mortar attack to answer the call of a wounded man and was killed while administering to him. A 1st Cavalry Division history says that when the 7th Cavalry Regiment was stationed in Tokyo after the war, the regiment's headquarters building was named McKnight Barracks in his honor. McKnight was 35 when he sacrificed his life to carry a wounded comrade out of the midst of battle, earning a posthumous Silver Star. He was one of at least 20 Army chaplains who died during the liberation of the Philippines. In the libraries of Hendrix College in Conway, Arkansas, where the Methodist Chapel's stained glass window is dedicated to McKnight, a quote from one of his last letters home is preserved. Writing from the battlefield, McKnight said to his parents,
"The going is tough. If the worst comes to me, I shall look down from heaven watching my parents, 7 brothers and 3 sisters, and shall be waiting to meet them one by one as you enter the gates of heaven."